First, let me begin by apologizing for this delay that I've caused you, but then the heavy traffic, unfortunately, is not in my control. I'm very grateful to the organizers for having invited me to present the keynote address. And I feel a little inadequate for the purpose, despite having spent a fair number of years in both being a major user of data in the government and then a major generator of data for the government. The inadequacy actually comes from the fact that governments are typically about the most complex organizations you can think of in the world. Even the largest global MNCs do not compare in complexity to the smallest of companies. And so when one is talking about data, one has to be very careful. What are we talking about? So what I'll try to do is put some of my experience in government into a framework, into a perspective where perhaps some of you will be able to place your activities. Although from what I noticed, a fairly large chunk of you are on the data provision and data management side. And I don't know how many of you are really from the policy side, which is really the user side. If one looks at government activities and the use of data in government activities, there are four broad categories of activities that any government officer engages in and will do so at some point in his or her career. The first is identification of issues and problems. The second is, having identified an issue or a problem, to design an intervention. So that's the second. Having designed an intervention, to monitor the implementation of that intervention. And finally, after having intervened and monitored, make sure it's worked well, to do an evaluation. So it's IIME. Each of these are actually hugely data-intensive processes, if you dare to think about it. The problem is, number one, the types of data you need for the four types of activity are very different. And it is futile to think that you can have a single data set that's going to do it all for you. It will not. The main thing that we need to keep in mind is that at the end of the day, the government is also structured in terms of its sort of institutional structure, with different responsibilities being given to different officers within the system. So it is conceptually possible for us to break down the data needs depending upon the functions that a particular individual or a particular office is playing. But having done so, you then run the risk, and this, by the way, is endemic in government, is getting into silos where within a particular ministry or a department, you have four joint secretaries doing four different functions and never talking with each other. Indeed, this is one of the commonest problems of government. So when one is really talking about data systems, one needs to keep in mind that these four, which are really analytical constructs that one is making, are really integrated in an important sense. And that there are always feedback and feed-forward loops from each of these four things. Let me begin then with the issue of identification of issues. Typically, a government department will have a well-defined area of its operation. Some of the departments, of course, are more overarching, like the finance, or perhaps planning, but most of them have fairly well-defined areas of operation and the sorts of issues and problems that it is supposed to deal with. And these are laid down in fairly great detail into the allocation of business units. So presumably, from the allocation of business rules, one should be able to figure out what is the kind of information that you need to be able to see how your sector, as it were, is performing. Is there a problem that needs to be addressed? The problem, of course, is that more often than not, you will not have the machinery to collect that data. And that data would have to be collected by somebody else. Quite typically, this function is carried out by the Ministry of Statistics at the center and the Department of Economic and Directorates of Economic and Statistics of the states. But again, if you take the trouble to talk with the people who are in these functions, what you will find is that even in this role, their mandates are restricted. So what you do get is that even as a descriptive delineation of the system that we are dealing with, there is an inadequacy of data simply because, or not just of data, of information at large, simply because there hasn't been enough thought given to how this information should be collected and placed before the larger group. This is just the identification is very, very data intensive, but it's a relatively easy kind of data. Most of the data that you need, most of the statistics that you will use when you are doing identification issues is descriptive statistics of various kinds. Most of us tend to stick to things like averages, means, things of that kind. Some of us actually do look at things like dispersion, but by and large, this is descriptive. And you can look at single data sets and say, yes, the problem is cropping up. The real issue comes at the second stage, which is when you've identified a problem or an issue that needs to be addressed, and you have to design an intervention. Interventions come in two types. One type is policy. Policies are about changing the rules of the game so that people's behavior, not just people, agents' behavior, change in a particular way to subserve the objective that you're seeking to attain. So policies are about behavioral change. The second are basically programs, most commonly known as schemes, but programs are vital, which are direct interventions by government in the delivery system. Now, both are interventions, but the two operate very differently. Policies are about changing behavior. The programs are usually about taking behavior to be given as we understand it and designing an intervention which rides on those behavioral attributes. This is the most analytic intensive part of any government activity. And this, unfortunately, is the part where, at least in my 20 years of experience, we are the weakest. If you think about policy making, right, what you will find is that in most cases, there is a jump from a description to a solution. The analytical part seems to be a little, well, what should I say, at the gut feeling level. I think the only organization which actually clearly comes out and puts the analytics down in black and white is the Reserve Bank of India. I cannot think of any other wing of the government which bothers to do so. And the suspicion is that they do not bother to do so is because they don't bother to do so at all. So this is, and by the way, policies are tough, because to do policy right, you must understand, number one, you must understand behavior. Much more importantly, much more difficultly, you must understand what will change that behavior. Now, here as I said, RBI comes out right up in front and says, I'm increasing interest rate because I believe all of you guys are rational people, and when I increase interest rate, you will reduce your investment and you will increase your savings. That's the analytical part. Find me anybody else who says that. So this is difficult. Anybody who has actually worked on trying to infer behavior and behavioral change from data will tell you it's extremely hard work, it's extremely sophisticated work. The second part, which is the design of programs, particularly design of schemes, is equally difficult, but of a different kind. Because any intervention, and think about it, any intervention is going to change behavior. So unless you understand how that change is going to happen, you may actually design your programs wrong. In fact, the common complaint against our government is very largely the delivery systems don't work, the entire public says, the government delivery systems don't work. But an equally common charge is that the programs are badly designed. Designing a program is not, guys sitting down and saying, okay, we have to have, let's say, a polio program, and so let's send out, 2 million guys with vials of polio and give it to every child around. That's not design of a program. The design of a program is understanding what will bring the kids to get the pollution. We know, for instance, in UP we had a problem where a very large section of the Muslim community said that the polio program was designed actually against them. This is an understanding one has to have, and you do have it. But this is perhaps something that will not come out of data, but it comes out of information. But there's a lot of other things which does, in fact, come out of the data. But the data needs for both policy and the design of programs is very different from the pure descriptive. The pure descriptive is only one component. You then need to have a whole bunch of other variables which allow you to do the analytics that are necessary to be able to carry out both this function of designing interventions. Having done that, we go to monitoring. Now, this is something I think most people in government understand very well. And I must say that over the time that I've been in government, the kind of improvement we've seen in the MIS systems of ministries has been phenomenal. When I first joined, they were pathetic. Now, actually, they're pretty good. So this is something we understand well. So I won't elaborate on this one. Then we come to the last one, which is evaluation. This is tricky. Evaluation is, in economics, one of the more complex functions that we perform. And evaluation is something which is very, very difficult to do unless you actually embedded it in your whole design process, which means you start at the point where you identify the problem and you are thinking about any intervention. The evaluation process must be built in from that stage itself. And evaluation systems need to feed back into the monitoring system and back into the design system. This is a part where we all fall down very badly. So if you really look at it, of the 4 components I talked about, there are 2 components which we do a reasonable job of, not great, but reasonable job of, which is the identification and the monitoring. The 2 that we actually do a very poor job of are the 2 which are analytically the most demanding, which is the designing interventions and the evaluation. Now, why is this difference? The difference really comes that whereas the identification and monitoring in an important sense requires data which is within the control of the ministry or department, the other two require you to go well beyond it. So when we talk about big data, we are not talking about high frequency data, or we are not talking about the census where you have 1.2 billion people and their particulars, so records going to God knows what magnitude. That's not big data. Big data is about a wide array of data which speaks with each other to be able to inform our decisions. So, you hear a lot of talk, I'm sure it's going to come later as we go along, about things like data mining. Data mining is wonderful when you have high frequency data coming in, and it's particularly useful when you're trying to detect things like fraud. It's a classic data mining kind of problem. All of it is ultimately based on what's called pattern recognition. But then somebody has to be able to specify what those patterns are. Because after all, the computer will generate patterns for you, but what pattern makes sense is a human activity. And that comes from very specific domain knowledge. But you will not be able to even specify it until you understand what the data is doing. So we are really talking about not just the presence of data or the ability to handle data, but what we are really talking about is to understand what data can do for us. And I hope that this half day will give us more insights into it, and I would very strongly urge all of you to ask questions. Ask questions, because what you will probably be getting exposed to are really the tools. But at the heart of it and behind all of that are the heuristics that you use in your day-to-day work. That converting those heuristics into something which can be given shape through numbers is really what we should be talking about. Thank you.